So to sort of complete the four-part series of the impact of the colonial administration or the colonialization in the development of Papua New Guinea, we are going to look at this lecture here, the post-colonial state, but focusing on socio-economic development. The early plans of the Somare government. What were they? The challenges that the Somare government faced, and how is that important when we try to look at development issues in our country? So the challenge during the time after 1978, rather 1960s up until 1978, the leaders of that time were trying to unite the diverse people. So trying to ensure that there is unity in progression towards independence. And one of the challenges were the nationalist separatist movements. And in addition to that, the socio-economic challenges. So we are going to look at briefly how that shapes the early government of the Somare government, and how that sort of affect the development goals and aspiration of the early government. So the objectives of this lecture, number one is to have an overview of or transition to independence, the challenges that were faced, the roles of nationalist movements and socio-economic policies shaping the post-colonial state, but more importantly, the post-colonial state that is administered one way or the other by our leaders during the time. And that sort of set the stage for discussion on challenges and opportunities faced during this period and after that period as well. Now, if you look at that timeline of events there, my apologies, it's not clear, but I've already uploaded it, the lecture notes here. Okay, I'll just go through it. So Papua New Guinea as a state, Papua New Guinea did not put itself as a state or establish itself as a state, not until 1949. 1949, the political structures of the state were established. So 1949, the Papua New Guinea Act brought the two territories together. This sort of ensured the gateway for political independence. By 1951, the first Legislative Council was formed. The first Legislative Council established or set the tone for the first House of Assembly election. In 1964, the first House of Assembly election. Now this is important. The first House of Assembly election ensures the idea of a representative government. This is the first time when our people had to choose their local elites to represent them. So the idea of representative democracy through election started. By 1968, second House of Assembly. Now by 1968, so an important era where the development of political parties, indigenous political parties, started to take shape. For example, in 1967, Pangu Party came on board as a force against the colonial government. In 1972, the self-government, or 1972, on a path towards self-government, our country came up with, or during that time, the first, what is called the first socio-economic policy. And in addition to that time, the first, you can say, separatist movement took place, and that is the Mataungan takeover in East New Britain. So the first sort of nationalist movement on East New Britain was about equality of business opportunity. This was against the expatriate, or they call it white settlers, on those plantations. So the people were seeing that they are not equally benefiting from, or all the business opportunities were given to the white settlers. Hence the formation of the Mataungan Association, all geared towards fighting for an equal deal. Now by 1973, self-government, but again another movement, okay, apart from Mataungan Association. Now why is this important? Because political mobilization under these various, they call it protest movements, are very important in formation of state. Understanding these movements is important for the political development of Papua and New Guinea. Now by 1973, when the government, or the colonial government, granted self-government, United Party under Sete Abal, the father of former Deputy Prime Minister Sem Abal, they wanted to break away from those coastal leaders, or Sumare and them, Pangu Party. So Islands faction were opposing self-government. And the reason being is that they were skeptical of the radical policies that were driven by the Pangu Party. They see that Highlands region came on to, let's say, recognition, establishment, or was explored around 1940. So they were trying to, or they saw that it was not the right time for self-government. And then 1975, 1st September 1975, saw the real threat, and that is the secessionist movement on the island of Bougainville. 1st September 1975, September 15th, yes, 1st September 1975, Bougainville declared a separate independent state. Their reason being that they wanted to break away from Papua New Guinea. Now, as a way of compromise to that, we will talk about that when we talk about decentralization policy. So because of Bougainville's anticipation to break away, the government had to negotiate the 19th province, or provincial government system. Okay, not forgetting the Papua Besana movement led by Josephine Abijah in the 1970s. The Islands faction, the Mataungan Association, and the Papua Besana movement were three micro-separatist movements that did not in any way wrestle power against, of course, instability on the political development, and as far as the indigenous or the Pangu Party leadership during that time. It was the separatist movement on the island of Bougainville led to the decentralization or establishment of the decentralization system in Papua New Guinea. Now, what that will tell us is that after 1975, the issues that will have serious threat to the political stability of our nation state, Papua New Guinea, today will come from regional threats as opposed to micro-nationalist movements. Now I'll try and go through each of these points here. Key points: transition to independence. So we've received independence in 1975, and during that time there were nationalist pressure groups. They were small but influential. They had diverse regional interest and opposition. That was in the three that I mentioned. And looking at the three nationalist, micro-nationalist pressure groups, Mataungan Association in the 1960s to 1972, they demanded takeover of expatriate plantation. Now this is important. Why? Because for the first time, our people were trying to fight for equality of opportunity in business or socio-economic development. They had a vision for a multiracial urban areas, and this is also another important theme to understand here. For the first time, they feel that they now have the same opportunity to involve in politics and socio-economic development alongside white settlers. So this will tell you how East New Britain, was once modeled as or once said to be a model province, was urbanized, was modernized as a result of these popular beliefs and opinions. While that was going on, the islands region, in the islands opposition, white settlers' business interests demanded delay in self-government. And the reason is suspicion towards radical coastal leaders like Sete Abal and the United Party were accusing the Pangu Party of their radical approach towards handling the government. And we will look at those radical approach when we talk about the 8-point plan. And then the Papua Besana movement, they opposed, the argument was that the 1949 Papua New Guinea Act forced Papua to be incorporated to Papua New Guinea, So Papuans were not, how should I put it, consulted, all right? So that was the argument. So they were not consulted and they were drafted into Papua and New Guinea. However, that movement was small, but it lacks widespread nationalistic support. So the three pressure group movements were small, but did not, it was not widespread enough to cause, any form of instability on the government and the colonial government. Now this is the threat here by Bougainville. Bougainvillians had an experience, early experience with the European exploitation. We've talked about the primitive accumulation. And then after 1945, the influx of multinational corporation coming in and the establishment of the Bougainville Copper Limited. Now this was conflict over land rights and also over benefits. We had discussed in our previous lecture, we've talked about how multinational companies, corporations came in and why they were needed because of their technology, knowledge, and resources. So the terms of reference in terms of negotiation was one-sided, all right, benefiting the Bougainville copper mine. And that led to the issue in Bougainville. And then by 1975, they demanded for separate independence. And 1976 saw the creation of the organic law and provincial government. That sort of resolved the issue. And you can see today they're at the forefront of autonomy. So again here, coming back to what I just said earlier, the threat towards Papua New Guinea's stability will not come from internal pressure groups, but it will come from regional threats. All right? Now we are seeing that in the islands region. The more conflict after conflict and build-up after build-up, that has the potential to cause instability on the state if it's not managed properly. So again here, the history tells us that Papua New Guinea's instability will come from regional threats and not internal or pressure groups. Now let's look at the socio-economic policy. You can say this is the first blueprint of Vision 2050, MTDS, whatever strategic government goals came about, they have the DNA, you can say the DNA of it started off from this 8-point plan here. Now what is this 8-point plan introduced by the Somalia government on 18th of December 1972? The basic goal was to address socio-economic aspects of our country. Now emphasis here, important here, the emphasis of 8-point plan are self-reliant and rural development. The emphasis of Vision 2050 is self-reliance and has rural development mentioned in it. You look at Marape's SME. SME is also captured in that self-reliant plan. So the 8-point plan here by this Somalia government is an important document for us students to read in order to understand the pathways of development of various successive development plans that our country adopted after independence. So there were two, okay, to address the socio-economic aspect, and self-reliance and rural development were critical in ensuring, or critical agenda for the Somalia government. Now what was the aim for the 8-point plan in terms of self-reliance? The aim was to reduce external economic and political dependence. We've talked about the economic aspect of dependency in Lecture 1, Unit 1, created an enclave economy and an import-dependent economy by 1945. After 1945, the role of state in the economic development. So when the Somalia government came or took office, they already know the structural aspect of, you can say, the political economy of our country. And one of their first mission was for self-reliance. That is to reduce economic dependence, economic and political dependence on the Australian government or the colonizers. The challenges of this idea of self-reliance came in the form of lack of political mobilization and grassroots support. This is very true for the other plans, okay, at present. If you want to introduce any form of self-reliance, okay, in terms of your public policy, in terms of public policy making in our country, you need political mobilization. You need the general support of the people. Now, what the Somalia government found out was that for those plans to work, they had to seek support or mobilization, and they did not seek that very support from the people. Now, that can translate into many forms, but one of these is or came through the various leaders in parliament criticizing the 8-point plan. Now, secondly and most importantly is the reliance on aid, particularly from Australia. When you talk about self-reliance, then you have to remove foreign aid. And Somalia government later found out that we can't talk about self-reliance without having some form of accommodation for foreign aid. So that was ridiculed and criticized of that self-reliance point when Somalia government presented this 8-point plan. How can you talk about having to be self-reliant when your economy desperately needed foreign aid support? No, it will haunt us in the near future, and it's an ongoing thing where all our plans, government plans, will talk about self-reliance. But the question is, are we truly self-reliant when our structure or the structure of our economy heavily rely on external intervention? The external intervention comes in the form of foreign direct investment. That means that you have to make accommodation for other business interests, for Chinese to come in and do business here, for Australians to come in and do business here. And in addition to that, our country relies heavily on borrowing to support our import dependence. So when you talk about self-reliance in that case, you cannot do away with borrowing. So in 2017, Pangu Party said it gave us political independence, and it's trying to give us economic independence. This is the same sort of narrative being repeated again. So the challenge for our development plan going forward after independence is that although we want to be self-reliant, the economic structure of our country does not allow us to be fully self-reliant. That's why we need to have some accommodation before we slowly address those structural adjustment problems before we can call ourselves self-reliant. You will see that Peter O'Neill came into government in 2012. James Marape came in 2018, I believe. James Marape wants to make PNG the richest black nation in the world. The same statement echoed by James Marape was echoed by Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare in his 8-point plan here. And again, challenges are in the economic structure of Papua New Guinea. So regardless of whatever plan that is put in place by our government, if we do not account for the structural aspect of our economy, then our plan would not come into fruition. Okay, rural development was another aspect of the 8-point plan. The emphasis was about building and modernizing the rural areas. The Somare government had a plan for rural development. However, we've talked about that in our Unit 1 and Unit 2, the challenges of setting a plantation system as a result of lack of labor. So the challenge of properly establishing a plantation system and the impact of it has led to uneven, or let's say enclave effect, where urban centers were more developed than the rural centers. Now, the enclave effects that we have sees more focus on the urban centers than the rural centers. So, what the 8-point plan found out was that if you want to build or develop the rural area, there needs to be proper infrastructures put in place. By 1973, the Somare government found out that it did not have necessary infrastructures for them to even go and build something in the rural areas. Even the colonial government tried to set up plantation. It was not profitable. So you cannot set up a factory in the remotest part in Teleformim, West Sepik, and you expect investors to go and invest and develop that region. Investors will go to areas that they see that there is profitability in. So enclave effect, and such a way that rural development will be affected or was affected during Somare government or during Somare's time, and even today. So the enclave effect, in other words, in Papua New Guinea, the urban centers have a pull factor in terms of employment opportunities and economic development. That is why any major development, our government funding, if you look at our budget, all government funding is chewed up or spent in all urban areas than the rural areas. And as a setback of it, the rural areas are now taken over by DSAP and PSAP politics. Now, the last point here, disparity in development bank loans favoring urban over rural areas. By 1973 up until 1990, the development bank loans, were going towards the urban sectors and not the rural sectors. So the challenge that Somare government faced during the time in terms of rural development again comes back to our what we've talked about in lectures 1 and lectures 2. So in lecture 1 and lecture 2, there wasn't any focus or strategic focus on developing most parts of our country. Only those that you can say, those areas that were important. Let's say the German plantation in East New Britain, West New Britain, and in the Papuan region, Port Moresby. So Rabaul and Kokopo was able and better developed as a result of the presence of German establishment, New Guinea Company. And so when the government comes in, it's easier to develop that part of the region because there is already existing infrastructure in place. Now you can't say that for places in the islands or in what I just mentioned, West Sepik, Telefomin. You can't, because if you go there, there's just forest, vegetations that are not conducive. So going forward, although the government would call for rural development, agricultural development, the challenge would be for them to address these structural economic conditions. And that structural economic condition is to address the import-dependent economy. We are importing more and exporting less. Unless we export more and import less, then focus will be more on rural development than urban development. It is the rural areas that will tend to export more. You don't export cacao, coffee in Port Moresby. No, you export cocoa, coffee in the rural areas. So unless the government focus more on exporting, okay, and build up the our export base, then we would address some of these challenges here. But this is one of the key challenges that the Somalia government, okay, 1972 to 75 or even 77 faced. The next point is regional equalization. This is an ongoing issue. So again here, so the colonial administration during that time, their concentration was on economically viable areas. And those economic viable areas are, and we discussed that, in the German New Guinea area, in Papua region, but mostly here in the central province, Port Moresby, where there is presence of the colonial administration, and to a certain extent, sub-regional centers along the coast. By independence or self-government, there were significant funding disparities between urban areas and other regions. So Port Moresby was, okay, or should I say Port Moresby received more funding than other regional areas. Okay, and it's still happening today. The provincial government are complaining, calling out for fairness in terms of regional government or government allocation in funding. And this is one thing where when the decentralization policy set in, there were a big regional differences in terms of funding allocation, infrastructural grants, and also development in those places. So although 8-point plan talks about regional equalization, it calls for regional equalization, but that is not the case when you look at regions in Papua New Guinea. So rural development and regional equalization in the 8-point plan did not eventuate as a result of the enclave effect. Okay, enclave effect. So the enclave effect is that only urban centers and mining centers tend to attract, okay, cash, revenues, opportunities at the expense of other centers. So the other areas apart from Port Moresby, and let's say Port Moresby, are agricultural dependent. But if there's no focus on elevating the agricultural capacity through exporting, then regional disparities will still exist and rural development challenges will still exist. And then decentralization policy. So one of the 8-point plan was to create decentralization. And the main focus was to devolving powers to provinces. That is captured in the 1973 CPC report. It advocates for substantial powers from provincial governments. So the idea for decentralization came about as a result of Bougainville's intention to move away. So initially, the organic law on provincial government system, 1976, introduced decentralization as a means of empowerment. And when we talk about decentralization next week, we will see how decentralization moved from this empowerment idea towards supply and demand idea or effectiveness idea. So empowerment, by devolving power to the provinces, you empower provinces to to feel like they belong or they have a political autonomy. So the initial call for decentralization was calling for political autonomy. Later it was changed in 1975. So one of the 8-point plan was by the Somali government was to empower its people through decentralization. Empower in terms of devolving important powers from the Waigani or Konidobu during the time to the provinces. However, by 1995 reform, all those powers that were given to the provinces were taken back to Waigani. And after 1995, we've seen now the governors now are calling for this power to be returned back to the provinces through decentralization or through empowerment form of decentralization. Okay, lastly was economic opportunities for nationals. As part of the 8-point plan, if you look at this economic opportunity for nationals, the idea, Somali government wanted to create what is called an indigenous business class or indigenous entrepreneurial class. And that same vision is carried forward by James Marape through his SME policies. Now the reason being that by 1972 there was absence of any indigenous business enterprise. Absence of indigenous business enterprise saw other nationals coming in. And we can't blame the Chinese for coming in and setting up business in Papua New Guinea. And we are trying to remove them and chase away these Chinese nationals. They came in here as a result of absence of any indigenous enterprise. So the government after 1972, all government plans have focused on creating business opportunities for people. And that is captured in the 8-point plan. Somali government, through various initiatives, extended the state role in the economy in trying to create indigenous business enterprise. One of those, the very first initiative was the creation of NDB, National Development Bank, or National Agricultural Bank during that time, was to give out loans to our people. So sometimes Prime Minister James Marape would like to take credit for some of these reforms here. But if you look closely, he is only following what has been, or initiatives that were started by our founding fathers. So one of those was trying to create a indigenous enterprise or business enterprise for our people, so we can participate in business. Okay, promotion and subsidization of indigenous businesses through the creation of National Agricultural Bank, National Development Bank, and now we have Me Bank, all those banks popping up in the rural areas. So again, I put here contemporary parallels with Marape's SME philosophy. That Marape's philosophy, okay, was borrowed, okay, by the legacy that he occupied. All right? So what I'm saying here is that the 8-point plan by the Somalia government is a reaction of the socio-economic challenges of our country during that time and also after independence. So if, when you read the chapter here, it gives you a detailed explanation and discussion about the issues and challenges faced. So this concludes the lecture for today.